I welcome you all to the second session of the ICF travel series that we launched last week. And today we are lucky to have a very distinguished guest with us, Mr. Dhruv Bogra, who is an adventure cyclist, and he undertook a 15,000 kilometer cycling journey from Dead Horse in Alaska to Cusco in Peru. So that was a solo journey, and he is the only Indian to have done it. And based on that journey, he has even written a book called Grit, Gravel, and Gear. So we have the editor of that book who has edited that book also with us today. And so Dhruv will take us on a nice adventure in the next 1 hour. Over to you, Dhruv.
Right. Thank you, Vivek. A very warm welcome to all of you. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining this session. Uh, I will try my best to try and take you through the journey undertaken over 400 days on a bicycle, solo and unsupported from the top end of the world, from a place called Dead Horse on the Arctic Ocean uh, till Cusco in Peru, like Vivek just mentioned, in South America. This was a journey that was basically self-funded, self-driven, and was, in my mind, the most epic journey of my life. In many respects, I came back a changed man and much more knowledgeable about the world. Before I start the presentation or storytelling, I'd like to show you a small film that I created once I had come back in 2017. This film is called The Arctic to the Andes Journey, and it's going to be for about 5-6 minutes. Uh, Please take a look at it.
Vision of discovering freedom and cycling the world found seed in the cold and dreary Arctic tundra in Dead Horse, Alaska, 400 kilometers above the Arctic Circle. As I moved closer to my 50s, I realized that my entire life had passed by, and I longed to explore and experience the raw beauty of the remotest parts of the world and its indigenous cultures. So one day, I took the decision to choose to walk away from the system and plunge into the unknown. Having to carry all your camping and sleeping gear, bike tools, food and water and other essentials, and cycle solo and unsupported from the Arctic to the Andes. I climbed small hills and lofty mountains every other day with 4 panniers and gear weighing over 40 kilos. There is no protection from the cold, hard rain, blinding sun, chilly headwinds. My body grew stronger over many thousand meters of climbing, and I developed greater resilience over the lack of food and water. My mind grew accustomed to the beautiful sound of silence, with only the wind, the whir of my tires, and the sound of birds in the sky to keep me company. I named my beloved companion my bicycle Quest, and she became my trusted steed of steel. I learned to survive the perils of the Dalton Highway and the Yukon. the thin air at 4,500 meters in the Altiplano of Peru, and the harsh Baja Desert in Mexico. The lack of potable water, availability of food, and the threat from bears in Canada or guns in Mexico or Central America did not deter me. Instead, it made me stronger each day. Cycle touring involves a lot of daily planning over the amount of food or water to carry, studying the route and terrain, looking up the weather for the next few days, and identifying possible camping stops for the night. The rush of hot water on my back, the smell of clean clothes, a cup of freshly brewed coffee were luxuries for the soul. Life was down to the basics and to 2 pieces of underwear and my tiny home, my tent that I crawled into each night. I spent my life being told by society and the system what to learn, how to make money, and where to spend it. That I found myself lost in a maze of leading a life, not living it. I cycled in the remotest parts of the world, amidst bears, wolves, alpaca and the vicuña, glaciers and deserts, lakes and rivers, and the highest mountains. I did all this not just for a few days, but for 400 days. Much of my journey took me to the heart of the countries I visited, and I met many indigenous people, especially in Mexico, Central America, and Peru. Their simplicity, smiles, and friendliness live within me. The 400 days on the bicycle taught me that we need to challenge our limiting beliefs that stop us from reaching our unimaginable potential, to change the system, fiercely protect our animals and forests, that global warming and climate change are real, and that the culture and languages of the indigenous people in the world need to be saved.
Om Namo Bhagavate Rudraya.
Bicycling the Americas revealed to me that it is what I was meant to do. It showed me what kind of resilience and struggle I was capable of. Out there, I was on my own and overcoming each obstacle, whether it was a broken spoke, or a fire that would not light, or a water filter that would not work. I also found incredible friends for life from small towns and big cities, and forged deep, unexplainable bonds with other cyclists and travelers on the road. It made me experience raw freedom and joy and record the journey for posterity and share it with others. It is what I am. It is what I will always be.
So basically, the video explains why I undertook this journey. And I was 48 at that time, working in corporate India as a retail director for Adidas. And I'd been cycling for about 7, 8 years. I traveled to the Himalayas very often, to the Western Ghats. And I was enthralled by being in the mountains, cycling on my own, exploring places. And therefore, I decided to, go further than Indian shores and travel some parts of the world. Of course, there are many routes in the world available, such as the Silk Route, the Siberian route. There is a North America, South America one, which I did. And of course, a lot of people also from America and South America and Europe also tour Africa. So I chose to cycle from North America to South America. I spent about 400 days on the saddle of my bicycle, cycled about 15,000 kilometers, much of which was over mountains, almost 6,000 kilometers of cycling in the mountains. It is really quite amazing how many mountains there are in the world. And almost 250,000 feet of elevation gain, which is like equivalent to climbing Mount Everest 7 times. And I camped outdoors in the wild for over 200 nights of the 400 that I was on the road. how did this all start? This started with a very, sort of exposure to the world of touring and mountain biking. While I was in Mumbai, I used to look up a lot of magazines. And one day I saw this beautiful picture, a full spread of a cyclist going into the Bolivian mountains. And that picture really stuck in my head like a tattoo. And I said, this is what I've got to do. Of course, I had to wait for almost 7, 8 years for that dream to come
Excuse
true.
me, voice is not clear.
Okay. Can everybody else hear me?
Well, I can hear you, Dhruv. Now I don't know
Yes.
about the others.
Yes, I can hear you.
I can hear you
Okay.
too.
Okay.
Yeah, hear you.
Ma'am, maybe you just need to check your internet connection because that could be breaking.
Dhruv, can you please increase your volume a little bit?
Okay.
Can you
I
increase your
have.
volume?
Okay, just a second. How is it now?
Yeah,
It's
Better.
clear.
Better?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. So, I of course started. Now you can hear me well enough?
Yes.
Okay. So I started obviously going a lot into the mountains, like I said, in the Himalayas and Western Ghats. I started researching blogs to prepare for this dream. I looked at maps, routes, planned my bicycle and gear, and also obviously
Better,
started.
much better.
Okay, great. And also started saving for the equipment and the journey. Uh, I'm a regular guy. I was doing, 9 to 9 job, working 12, 14 hours a day, and typically being in the retail industry, I had to travel 10, 12 days a month. So I had to fit in this whole lifestyle of not just working, but also putting in the longer hours by getting up at 4:30 in the morning to cycle and train for such a journey. I trekked a lot in the Himalayas in the winter, preceding this journey to prepare myself to sort of be in the Arctic kind of conditions, even though it would be just for 2, 3 weeks. And of course, planning for gear, equipment that you have to carry on the bicycle by yourself, almost 40, 50 kilos of it, for 2 continents is not an easy task. A lot of research has to happen about terrain, about weather patterns, about the wind, the snow, the rain. Because from North America to South America, the two different hemispheres of the world across many time zones, the weather can change dramatically depending on whether you're in glacial areas or you're in the desert. So all that equipment you have to design in such a way and buy in such a way that it all fits into these 4 bags, as you can see in this bicycle. Basically, it's got 4 bags which are called panniers. So they take in all the food, the tools, the stove, the water filter, a notebook to write a book or make notes, a tent, a tarp, a mat, a handlebar bag, the black thing that you see over there, which has got your cameras, your phone, passport, etc., and your sleeping bag, so that you can sort of sleep in it at night. And sleeping bag also has to be light enough and yet be able to take temperatures up to minus 10 degrees. So all this required a lot of planning. It took me a year to assess what kind of equipment I had to buy and where from, because this sort of stuff is not available in India, and it's very specialized, and I had to source it from many parts of the world, including the bicycle, the frame of which came from the US, the gear systems came from Japan and Germany, the tires came from England. So different components came from different parts of the world, and the bicycle took about 4 months to build and cost me about 3.5 lakhs. Then on top of that, you also have to buy a lot of specialized equipment, such as a water filter, which you can see on the right hand of the screen with the lever, the red thing, a satellite phone for emergencies. This is a text one, a stove, tenting system, bicycle tools. A lot of equipment is required because if you're on your own, you need to be able to survive in the desert or in the Arctic all by yourself without any help from anybody. So that's the code that bicycle touring guides travel with. We are not a breed of people who would take a lift in a truck. If we are too tired, we'll camp right there. Unless we are injured or we are very sick, we would not ask for food or water if it's not an emergency. We are supposed to be self-sufficient in every way. Even if it means that you pull out water from a dirty pond, you need to have the filtration system to be able to take care of it. On the road, survival food was, something that I could carry, which I could just buy off the shelf. You couldn't carry too much because I would barely carry food for 3 days, except for when I was in the Arctic when I carried food for 2 weeks. So most of it would be things like high energy, high calorie foods like coffee and Nutella and Skippy, peanut butter, chocolate jam and bread. These are the things that give you high energy because I was burning almost 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day. So what was my route like? Just to quickly take you through the route across two continents. I started from a place called Dead Horse, which was on the edge of the Arctic Sea. Or this section of the Arctic Sea is called the Beaufort Sea. And then from there till Fairbanks, which is about 1,000 kilometers, it's just barren land, 60 people in over a million square kilometers of land. Then from Fairbanks, I went down to the Yukon, Canada, and then to Vancouver, which is British Columbia. From there, I went down the Pacific Northwest of the Americas, from Victoria to San Diego, and then crossed over to Mexico, down the Baja Peninsula, from a place called Tijuana, right through to La Paz, where I crossed over to the mainland of Mexico on a ferry, and then on to the really famous places in Mexico, beautiful towns and cities like Guadalajara, Tequila, and even places like Chiapas de Corzo and Comitán, which is on the border with Guatemala. Then from Mexico, I crossed over to Central America to a few countries like El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, and Panama. And then from Panama, I had to actually take a flight to Peru because I was not getting visas on time. There were a lot of issues because my American visa had expired, and there were a lot of issues getting a visa on an Indian passport for a guy riding on a bicycle. So Peru was not a problem. So I flew down to Peru, and then I spent about 3 months there cycling in the Andes and going to various places of historical interest. But my actual journey started 400 kilometers above the Arctic Circle in Alaska. And this was a very rapid or a very dramatic transformation for me in 24 hours from being part of a corporate setup in Delhi to going and landing up in the middle of a snowstorm in Dead Horse in a few days' time. So the picture on the top left is my farewell party about 15 days before I landed up in Dead Horse. I quit my job and left, so there was a farewell party. And I went on this journey with no job, just some savings that I had.
A little louder, please.
Okay. I'm as loud as I can be right now. I'm almost on full volume. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. we
Okay,
can hear
great.
you.
So I was, like I said, this place is called Prudhoe Bay, and this is a section of that area where I started from. It's an oil field, and that's it. There are only people who work on the oil fields over there that live there. They live in containers. They don't even have proper homes, and it's a completely barren part of the world. And the Dalton Highway on which I was going to be riding is one of the most dangerous highways in the world because there are absolutely no pit stops on the way. There are no people living there. There are no emergency services, nothing. So this is the Dalton Highway, and I was snowed in on the first day of my trip. So all my training and my preparation really came to use. I met a couple of Swedish guys on the way in the snowstorm, and we camped together by the side of the road. As you can see, Alaska is bleak and beautiful. And then from there on, obviously, I went down to the more wooded parts of Alaska. As you can see, us camping in the forest here. I had to cook on the road on many days. Like this one particular shot of me cooking by the river, by the road, or just cycling through mountains. As I cycled through, I discovered and I met many people on the way, whether it was somebody driving by offering me water or somebody giving me encouragement and motivation on a really bad day, on a hot day, when I could barely cycle, or interesting travelers on the way, like this guy with a dog who was walking 5,000 miles from Dead Horse to Texas. He was a photographer and he had a stroller and walking with his dog Pablo, taking pictures along the way. So you met some really interesting people, great human beings with great compassion and kindness. I rode through really remote and endless long roads. I wouldn't meet anyone for 3-4 days at all. Just riding alone, through all these beautiful trees and mountains. It's just the sound of the wind in my ears and the whir of my tires, like I wrote in the book. And of course, you would hear the birds. Sometimes I would be trying to uh, keep a lookout for moose and bears, especially bears because they really abound in this part of the world. And sometimes they can even attack without provocation because this is the time when they are out of the cold in the Arctic hunting for food. And of course, sooner or later, I had to meet a bear, and I did that at a place called Haines Junction. He was barely 20, 25 feet away from me. Fortunately, he didn't attack me. And I often joke that maybe he didn't like my smell because obviously, since I was cycling to such remote areas, I used to barely bathe. There was no place to bathe. So probably I wouldn't have bathed for a week at a time when I spotted this fellow. And he was quite an amazing young chap. I named him Cherry Blossom because he had such shiny black fur. And of course, on the journey, surprisingly, in the month of September, which is still quite early to see the Northern Lights, I did see them. It was really a fascinating experience. Came across so many animals on the way of very different types that we don't normally experience or hear of, whether it was this owl or this particular snowshoe hare that turns white in the winter to protect itself from predators, or this duck which actually was off course by almost 1,000 miles because of global warming. It never travels to these parts from the Pacific Northwest to the Arctic, but traditionally it's never done that. So another example of what the climate is doing to our world. I camped along beautiful lakes and forests. This was in Canada and British Columbia on a very remote part of the world called the Caspian Highway. It's an interesting story behind this because I never intended to travel alone on this road. I had had enough of the Dalton Highway, which is remote enough and very hard to cycle. But someone said, you got to see this place. And as in life, sometimes you take the road unplanned for, you decide to take a risk. And I'm glad I took the risk because I have very fond memories of this route. There were beautiful lakes on the way, saw many bears, glaciers, beautiful towns of the highway, which were 200 years old, built during the gold mining phase of the country. Really amazing part of the world. I was also fortunate to have witnessed the great salmon migration in the Yukon. This is a salmon leaping 20 feet in the air to go to the other side of the river, up a fish ladder. It's an incredible sight to see the fish leaping 30 feet in the air and swim upstream 2,500 kilometers from the Pacific Ocean to their spawning sites. And of course, as you know, the female salmon, when she lays her eggs, she dies. And when those eggs become smaller, slightly bigger fish, they swim back to the Pacific Ocean and come back the following year. One of the greatest mysteries of the planet. From British Columbia, from the southern part of British Columbia, I moved to Jasper, to Parkways. And this is the Canada we all know, we read about because it is so beautiful and so picturesque. I think one of the most beautiful places on the earth. It's filled with glaciers, which are right up to your face. You know, Native American or what we call First Nation peoples, totem poles. They're very much a part of the history and the life over there, and that's what makes it such an enriching experience. You come across various animals such as the elk, and this was a place called Berg Lake, high up in the mountains near a place called Mount Robson, which I trekked up to see. As you can see, this glacier, it's already melted almost 60% from what it used to be 25 years ago. Another reminder, stark reminder of global warming, but one of the most beautiful glaciers I've ever seen. Really, really lovely. This was the route that I took to the glacier, filled with pristine wilderness that Canada is so famous for in the Rocky Mountains. One of the most exciting and most moving parts of my journey through Canada was my contact with the indigenous people. Of course, we know all about them. You all are very educated. You've read a lot. You've come across a lot of literature around these subjects. But I think for a lot of people around the world, the dying culture of the indigenous people is not really well heard of, including our own country. And this whole exposure really opened my eyes to how our languages and the cultures of these people have been systematically destroyed by the governments or the people that we sometimes look up to as, as democratic, so to speak. and kind of gives you a different perspective about life, that what you see is not what was actually existing. So this is one such case of the Canadians where they were incarcerated in boarding schools when they were young in the 60s, and they were sent back deprived of their language, their identity, their traditional dressing, and they came back as Western kids with names that they didn't choose for themselves, names like Peter and John and Tom. And what has happened is the Canadian government, obviously 20, 30 years later, has realized that they've destroyed an entire generation of people whose language is dying with the elders, because the language of the First Nations people is not written language. It's a spoken language. So now, of course, they set up these massive museums. This is in the Victoria Museum, and it's a tribute to the First Nation people. There's a language lab there where they bring in 90-year-old people to record the language for posterity. So I saw this again and again as I went down North America into South America, where again the Maya, the Aztec, the Quechua people were completely vanquished by the Spanish in the late 16th century. So as I said, I mean, I came across much of the indigenous cultures on the way, which was the biggest part of my journey after the wildlife and the natural landscape, which was how do we preserve and respect them, including in our own country. From Canada, I moved over to the west coast of the US. I ran straight into the Pacific Northwest monsoon. Every day I was typically cycling 50, 60 kilometers, 70 kilometers with about 40 kilos of gear. But it became very difficult in this part of the world with rain lashing me almost every day. And it was cold in October. You know, the temperatures during the day would be 10 degrees, 12 degrees, with the rain coming down hard. And obviously, I had a schedule to keep, so I couldn't just stay indoors and wait for the rain to pass, because it was going to be at least a few more weeks before the monsoon would end. So I had to keep going on, and each day I would arrive at a campground thoroughly drenched, pitch up my tent in pools of water, and somehow get by the night, and the next morning again push off again with half-wet clothes. But it was a beautiful experience as well, because I passed so many beautiful beaches, rocky coastlines, lighthouses, which really sort of made it all worth it. And I met a lot of interesting people on the way, staying in hostels, from generals to writers to authors to, just vagabonds as well. And of course, the Americas have got great scenery, great landscapes, picturesque farmhouses, and an abundance of bird life as well, which was prevalent everywhere. Whichever town I went to, was full of beautiful birds. Campgrounds had them, and they were really a delight to capture on the camera. One such place was a place called San Simeon, which is on the coastline, which has got numerous rookeries of these elephant seals. Each one weighs 600 kilos, and they come and hatch over here. There are thousands of them, just lying on the beach, enjoying the sun. And this was one of the photographs that I took. The lighthouses were a dream to stay in. Ever since I was a kid, I had read about them, and then I slept in numerous lighthouses on the way. There are these lovely hostels that they've created at the bottom of each of these abandoned lighthouses, and they're right on the edge of the sea. And it's just an enormous experience to hear the waves crashing in at night. And also, you meet various people when you stay in bunk beds. It's not a hostel uh, which is sort of just filled with school kids, but you also get a lot of elderly people who are traveling through the country on a holiday, and they use a hostel because they're pretty cheap to live in, anything from $15 to $20 a night. From Mexico, from the US, after going through San Francisco, the Sonoma Valley vineyards, Los Angeles. My daughter lives in Los Angeles, so I caught up with her for 4 or 5 days. I crossed over to Mexico, to one of the most dangerous cities called Tijuana. It's a hotbed of sex, drugs, prostitution, you name it. And there's a population of about 1 million people. But when I crossed over into Mexico, all the fear mongering that had happened in the US, telling me that I'm crazy to go into to Mexico without a gun, etc. I met such wonderful people and such lovely, warm, friendly, and I would actually say happy people, that I was just blown away by the kind of energy that this country has, and the kind of historical sites and the World Heritage sites that they have. And in spite of being a country which on economic parameters is almost the same as India, It's far more cleaner, it's far more, progressive in its thinking. In spite of being a Catholic country, it's still very progressive, and it's got tons of young people who mimic our own diaspora in terms of, uh, I would say, age and gender. But I found them far more progressive in their thinking, and it was a very, very happy country, and disgraced a lot in the media with violence. But that's always existing in various pockets of the world, and Mexico, unfortunately, also happens to be one of them. One of the first things that I had to obviously do was go through the Baja Peninsula, which is 450 kilometers of just desert. And I rode on a road like this for about 10 days, 12 days, with absolutely no human beings in sight. For some of you who may have seen Narcos on television, this is the area where they were growing uh, marijuana deep in the desert. And I would often find a lot of commando patrols on this road. But other than them, there was just one small town on the way of about 200 people, which I stayed in. And usually I was camping on the side of the road amongst the cacti. It was really beautiful. And Mexico threw up many surprises. This is Talavera pottery, which actually style of pottery, which came with the Europeans from Arabia. And I think from Arabia, it also came into India in the 17th century, but very, very similar to our motifs and designs. A lot of people would ask me, where did you eat in Mexico and how was the food? Well, I mostly ate along the way, along the highway. So these are highway food points, small little dhabas, what we would call them in India. There they're called loncherias. And typically the food would be rice and some chicken and maybe some guacamole and a fried egg on top of it. That's a favorite across South America and Central America as well. And it was good food. I mean, simple food, very cheap, but nothing exotic, obviously. But very nice, simple food. The sunsets in the deserts were absolutely fabulous each night. It also rains in the desert, so you'll be surprised to know, but it would rain very heavily on some nights. And I would have to. This is a ranch I stayed in one night, shelter under a thatched roof because my tent was beginning to leak, and I had to put it under some roof to avoid myself from getting wet during the night. So again, a life full of struggle and hardship on the way, but very, very rewarding. Along the way, I also met such really interesting people. These were four people. One of the runners is not here. They were basically marathon runners who were going to spend 2 years running a marathon each day from Alaska, from where I started in Dead Horse, to Ushuaia in Argentina, a total distance of about 28,000 kilometers. And I met them on the way. They had started much earlier than me from Dead Horse, so they were a few sometime ahead of me. But I did finally catch up with them, and it was amazing to see the kind of adventures people embark on. They were running for a differently abled society in Belgium, raising funds for them. But they ran for 2 years, a marathon a day. It's just absolutely incredible. 42 kilometers is just enormous and really fantastic. So very motivating to meet such people on the way, and that kind of gave me the encouragement to go on. This is again the Baja Peninsula in Mexico. When I crossed over to mainland Mexico, it was a different country altogether in terms of color, in terms of food, in terms of people's habits and lifestyle. The food became much richer, much more complex, and also tastier. Even in small restaurants or highway loncherias, I would find food really well prepared, very hygienic, very clean. Of course, I would also cook on my own, but there were times when I needed some extra nourishment and I would dig in as well. In the Mexico, one thing that I did not anticipate, in spite of all my research, was the kind of mountains I would encounter in Mexico. I mean, I was riding mountains almost every second, third day. I would ascend a mountain, come down to a valley, and then ascend a mountain again. And that really caught me off guard in terms of my strength and stamina, because still had to be built up to climb mountains every day. But yes, it was a great experience. Most of the Mexican highlands vary at an altitude of 4,000 feet to about 10,000 feet. So you go up to the peak summit at about 10, 12,000, come down to the valley, and then climb again the next day. So it was a lot of up and down climbing each day. But yes, the journey was made wondrous by all these beautiful flowering trees and the landscape around me, which was absolutely gorgeous. Once I'd come down the mountains a bit, I was on the plains again on the town to Guadalajara, and I came across these fields on the way. And I said to myself, "Oh my God, why would anyone plant so many cacti in the desert? And that also seems to be like a farm." Only later did I realize that they were the blue agave plant from which tequila is made. And I was absolutely fascinated because the pina or the cone from which tequila is made is underground, right? So they have to cut open the shrub and they take out this pina. Each pina weighs about 40 kilos. And of course, when I learned all this, when I reached the town of Tequila, which was a fascinating experience. From Tequila, I went down to Guadalajara, which is Mexico's cultural, uh, main cultural center, really, after Mexico City. So rich and beautiful architecture, opera houses, enormous cathedrals, cultural centers, uh, incredible architecture, incredible arts. It was a real eye opener to see that Mexico has all this from the Spanish era. One of the most, I think, moving spiritual experiences for me on the journey was the need to be close to some spiritual source. And, I found myself attending a church almost every day, stopping at a church, going inside and praying for strength, for moral recovery, because each day was exacting. I was far away from friends and family. Uh, Especially in Mexico, there are hardly any English speakers, and my Spanish was not good enough to actually be able to have a proper endless conversation with someone. So at times like this, the aloneness would really overcome me, and I found that going into a church would give me enormous strength and belief in myself. And yes, so I went to many churches. I photographed them and filmed them. I could actually write another book on just the churches in Mexico. They are so beautiful, and this was one of them. And why I put up this picture of this particular church in a place called Zamora is because inside the church there's a beautiful statue of Mother Teresa. And I was kind of astounded to see that. Saint Mother Teresa is what it said, Calcutta. And I was very proud to see that. And sorry, I don't have a picture of that here on this presentation. I missed putting it in, but yeah, this church. These are empanadas being cooked outside with sausages and things like that. And they are the staple diet in the afternoon in Mexico, in small towns. While I was riding, I also made it a point to visit many museums on the way as part of my cultural education. I've always been a history student in college too. I was a history student, but we never learned South American history in college. It was all Chinese or European or American. So this was a big part of my history journey, which I had missed. And I visited many museums to see the Maya, the Aztec, the Zapotec culture. Uh, and some of these museums are free, some were not, you have to pay. But it really filled my life with a lot of cultural richness. Towards the end of my journey in Mexico, I went to a place called San Cristobal, which is the home of the Zapatista rebels. They have pretty much a movement going on, which was, you could compare it to the rebellion in the Northeast that we saw in the 80s and 90s, or in the 90s in Kashmir, but far less violent, but still violent enough. And what fascinated me here was the Mexican government actually allows them to run their own restaurants to collect money for the movement. Currently, there's a truce for many years between the Mexican government and the Zapatista rebels. But I was fascinated to see this particular restaurant, very popular with all the foreign tourists and the locals, where there's live music and there's food and all the and the rebels who were killed in government action. The posters have been put up. So I was really amazed to see the openness in society and by the government to allow people to vent their feelings. It was quite a revelation. Over here, of course, I met an interesting story to tell about a guy called Shelby Joseph. You can see him in the picture with the children. He's a guy from Kerala who went there 17 years ago and married a lady who was a Zapatista rebel. She fled the country. She came to India to study in Delhi University, and they fell in love. He was working in the Delhi University that time, and he came back with her. They're married now. They have children, and he took me a lot of places there in San Cristobal. But again, a fascinating story of an Indian who's in Mexico, in the most remote part of Mexico, in the southern part. These are traditional hand bracelets from Guatemala, which was my next country. Guatemala, I entered quite quietly. No fanfare. It was a small town, which looked like any Indian small town. Guatemala is a country that is economically disadvantaged. There is a fair amount of poverty there, but amazingly friendly people. If Mexico was friendly, Guatemala was super friendly. And of course, this is a bus called the Chicken Bus, which is very famous there. These are converted American buses who are painted and put a lot of chrome and all is put back on them, and they use as public transport in some of the Central American countries. They're full of lights and music, and they're called chicken buses because people carry livestock also in them, including pigs, from one village to the other. These are the indigenous Maya people who live in Guatemala and who make a living. Why I call them indigenous Maya people? Because as the Spanish conquered most of Mexico and Southern America in the 17th and 18th centuries, millions of them died. And what came into force was a caste system called the caste, which actually pushed these people down, who were the original owners of the land, down the bottom of the social ladder. And it was the the Spanish from Europe, who assumed power and business and industry, and they became sort of the upper caste. And that system still exists till today. And across South America, it's not just restricted to Guatemala, but across Mexico and South America, the brown skinned indigenous people are usually at the bottom end of the social and economic ladder. But they make their living by selling handicrafts, crafts from the villages. They come into the tourist towns and sell them and make a living. This is a beautiful town of Antigua, which was the traditional capital of Guatemala. We then moved to Guatemala City after the volcano of Fuego exploded 100 years ago and destroyed most of the city except for some parts of it. Again, a very quaint town steeped in history and culture. From here, I went to Tikal, which is the, the seat of the Maya Empire, a grand city lost in the forest, and as famous and as beautiful as the sphinxes in Egypt. This is the Temple of the Jaguar, which dates back to almost 1,000 years ago. Well preserved, beautifully excavated, and really grand marvels of architecture. I spent 2 days here. It was really marvelous to see uh, this place. It had been a dream to come here. And though it was very far from Guatemala, but it was really well worth it. From Guatemala, I went to Nicaragua, which is again beautiful country with volcanoes, lovely, colorful towns. Reminded me a lot of India with its dances and culture and roadsides, but very clean, very, very clean cities, all of them, very well maintained. Small cities, maybe 30,000, 40,000 people, 100,000 people, but grand monasteries and churches. And after riding for about 4 weeks in Central America, I reached Costa Rica, which is a beautiful tropical country with the most amazing rainforests in the world. Great area of great biodiversity, very well maintained, and of course they don't have a standing army. So all the money that they save there goes into maintaining the forest and looking after the natural resources. As I mentioned, after I went into Panama from Costa Rica, I flew to Peru. Peru was a country that I had always wanted to go to. I've had, I think, some sort of a spiritual connection with that land, especially the Incas. And when I landed there, it was a beautiful feeling of having come back home. This is Lima, which is the cultural capital of the Americas. I rested here for a week, got my bicycle repaired, and stuff like that. And you know, I knew that I had a long, hard journey ahead of me to climb to the Andes, which is one of the highest ranges along with the Himalayas in the world. Went to lovely museums which are full of ancient relics, 2,000-year-old masks, 2,500-year-old statues, which was beautifully kept and maintained, and a real education in history. I left Lima for Nazca, which was the home to the famous Nazca line, and this was the highway to that particular city, 400 kilometers away. And you'll be amazed to know that what you see here are not mountains, but mountains of sand dunes. And this part of the world is one of the driest places on earth. It barely receives any rainfall and is actually co-joined to the Atacama Desert in Chile. So it kind of leads up to that. And it's completely barren except for small settlements on the way. And this is one such place which I went to called Hakachina, which is an oasis in Peru. I mean, I just couldn't believe it that there was an oasis in South America. I'd never heard of one. It is the only oasis. And here it is. After a lot of riding on my bicycle, I was riding in the sand. I couldn't believe it that I would be in an oasis, really. It was a beautiful small town with a beautiful lake and a lot of palm trees and huge sand dunes with people sort of riding around in sand buggies. It was amazing. From here, I reached Nazca. Again, a dream came true of flying over the Nazca line, which I read about like when I was 13 years old in Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods. A real fascinating book and very, very postulates that Earth was visited by aliens and life on Earth was created by aliens, or at least we were visited many times, and great civilizations were built on the alien knowledge of materials. And these are the famous Nazca lines in the desert, which you can't see from the road. Even when they were building them 2,000 years ago in the desert, they couldn't see what they were drawing. But when you look at them from the air, they look perfect, and they're all pointing towards certain astrological configurations in the sky. So, very fascinating place. It's a mystery that hasn't been cracked by scientists over the last 40, 50 years since they were first discovered. From Nazca was a complete climb. I was only climbing every day. This was my first day of my climb from Nazca. I took this film from at about 8,000 feet. It had taken me most of the day to climb that much because it was very steep. So it's like from Nazca to the pass that I had to climb first. So it's like going from Delhi to Ladakh in 100 kilometers. That's how steep the road is and how fast it climbs up the mountains and how much the mountains just rise. It's called the continent. It's like the continental shelf. So just the mountains just come out of they don't rise gradually. They just rise very suddenly. And it was a very tough climb. The 100 kilometers took me 3 days. And of course, they were sweetened by my third day at an arrival at a vicuña reserve, which I didn't know about. Vicuña are an endangered species. They are the ancestors of the llamas, and they were sought after by the Inca kings whose royal robes were made from their fur, and to sort of kill a vicuña or to steal their fur would result in death in those days. But when the Spanish came, obviously they didn't believe in all this. They killed millions of vicuña in this region, and by the early 60s, there were barely 30, 40,000 vicuña left. And now with a lot of restoration work that has happened, there are almost 350,000 of them in the world, in between Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina. But a beautiful animal. I spent half a day in the afternoon at an altitude of 13,000 feet. This was at 13,000 feet, just photographing them. From there on, obviously, I kept climbing. And as you can see, I was climbing on Peruvian Andes, the plateaus at 12,000 feet, 13,000 feet. It was a phenomenal experience. Just being there out in the cold by yourself, cooking your own food. Along the way in the Andes, obviously, I came across many small towns. This was a scene I shot in a town called Puquio, which is in the Peruvian highlands at about 9,000 feet. The ladies you see here this is the traditional dress they wear. And the bowler hats is an interesting story. So the bowler hats came to Bolivia in the early 19th century, early 20th century, or maybe the late 19th century, with British workers who were working there on some railway lines. And bowler hats were sent to them from England, but they had made their size too small. So the person who bought the bowler hat sold them to the women there. And since the early 1900s, the women in Bolivia started wearing bowler hats. And you can read about it. It's a fascinating story how they become a fashion symbol in that country. and in southern Peru where I took this picture. And the bowler hat is now a part, it's not a traditional costume of the Inca people or the Quechua people, but it is a Western concept that came from England in the early 1900s. Ultimately, the highest altitude that I climbed to in Peru was 15,500 feet. I remember going past this lake, it was frozen. I was riding in winter, so there's no snow because it's so dry. Like I said, it's the driest place on earth, so there's no moisture, so there's no snow. But it's bitterly cold. And uh, still at this altitude, there were alpaca herds. This is an alpaca part of a herd. So there are these nomadic settlers who've been living there for the last 1,000, 2,000 years, who move, but who live here actually. They don't even go down to the plains or to warmer temperatures. They have these lodges made of stone and rock and thatch. They live there, and their existence is around raising the alpaca and using the meat and the milk to survive and to also sell to villages around in that area. From here, I traveled another 400 kilometers and I reached Cusco, which is the heart of the Inca Empire, the greatest empire of maybe even bigger than the Roman Empire, and it kind of held sway over large parts of South America, very rich, till the Spanish came and vanquished them. Of course, the Spanish built a fabulous capital on the destroyed temples and homes of the Inca people in the 16th century. So as you can, most of the architecture base is the Inca temples and Inca foundations. And on top of that, the Spanish built these villages. In this photograph also, you can see, if you see the base and the cobblestones, these go back 300-400 years. The stones which are cut in squares are from the Inca times, with a fabulous pieces of architecture. These are some of the traditional Inca people at work making handicrafts, rugs and shawls and stuff like that. This is a square in Cusco, again going back to 400-500 years back. And from Cusco, I traveled to the Sacred Valley, but another place that I traveled to was the deeper extreme of the southern part of Peru, which is the Rainbow Mountains. They were discovered about 4 years ago when the ice melted due to global warming, revealing these huge mineral deposits on these mountains, which give us this lovely color. This picture was taken at about 16,000 feet, into the long, arduous climb to get here, but really well worth it. One of the most beautiful places in Peru, I would say, in terms of its grandeur. These are the traditional Quechua people who make a living here in their traditional attire. Some boys in a small village at about 14,000 feet, very close to the Rainbow Mountains. This is the dance of the Condor, which is very famous in Peru. This dance I saw when I was climbing up to Machu Picchu from Aguas Calientes. It's a small town at the base of Machu Picchu. My journey kind of ended in a place called the Sacred Valley, and I call it my soul journey because I really felt that once upon a time, perhaps in some lifetime, I was born here, because I just couldn't pull myself away. I spent almost 7-8 days here at the base of this mountain you see in the background called Mount Chicon, and it's a beautiful valley down below where I stayed with an old man who used to bake breads and potatoes for me every day. Incidentally, potatoes are actually, they were born in Peru. They originate from Peru. There are 4,000 varieties of potato in that country. And the Europeans came there, they took the potatoes back to Europe, and that's how it found its way to India. But originally, the potato comes from Peru, and he used to make some amazing dishes for me every night, along with some amazing types of bread. From this place, I explored other places like the salt mines and ancient agricultural stations around that area, which is again very fascinating. This is Machu Picchu. So again, a dream destination to go to. It's on the map of many travelers, both the explorer type and the tourist type. But a really mystical place. I'm glad I went there. I almost skipped it, but it has energy of its own, which is hard to describe. Once I came back in July 2017, I spent the next 6 months completing my book. I named it Grit, Gravel and Gear. It's 387 pages with maps and pictures, and it was edited by Jyotirmoy, who's in this group today. He and I had so many coffees together discussing this book. I think he also became very involved in the journey and had a lot of perspectives which helped me to put some things in the right context for the reader. So it was a great partnership, I would say, from a book writing process point of view, where this being my first book, obviously, I wanted to be as perfect as I could make it. It was a dream to write a book from the time I was in school. So when I did write it, I tried to put in a lot of details with respect to history, culture, maps, pictures, stories, um, mythological stories, not just a cycling book. How many kilometers did I cover today or what happened to my bicycle? That is just 25% of the book, but 75% of the book is about the places I went to, the people I met, the food I ate, the kind of cultural place I was in, what is the history of the place, trying to put in interesting nuggets because for most Indian readers, South America is very much an unknown land and not many people know about it. So I tried to make it interesting, and Jyotirmoy was a big part of that journey while writing the book. The book has been traditionally published by The Right Place, Oxford, and it has been doing quite well. It was in the top 100 list of all international and national titles at Crossword Bookstores in 2019. Subsequently, during the lockdown in the month of April, I wrote another book called Away. So this was a very small book. I wrote it during the lockdown in about 30 days. It was a collection of a few stories I'd written earlier, which had got published in some magazines like Condé Nast, and some sort of fresh stories of adventures I undertook in the Indian Himalayas, which I thought would be more endearing for an Indian reader who would find it more relatable, perhaps in some way. Uh, but because this book, why I wrote this book also was because of the feeling of being constrained inside a home for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks for somebody like me, and the fact that suddenly the traffic stopped and I could hear birds all day, and it kind of inspired me to write a book that would inspire others to use this time we were caged to our homes to finally uncage ourselves and go and find a life for ourselves in the mountains or in the outdoors and really relish that experience. So that was the inspiration behind the book, and it's a collection of adventures from the Western Ghats, the Indian Himalayas, right from Sikkim to Ladakh to Uttarakhand and Himachal, and also a couple of stories from Alaska before I undertook the trip, uh, the Arctic to Andes trip. So this is it from me. Thank you so much. I think I've taken about just in time. I think 7 minutes short. Maybe we could throw it open to some questions that you may have or anything you may want to share with me. Thank you.
Thanks, Dhruv, for taking us on a journey across the world, and it was a fascinating journey. We do have some queries in the chat box.
Okay.
So Divya Munjal is asking, how much money did you have to spend on the equipment, and how much on the total trip?
Yeah. So uh, I'll give a breakdown. Because of the special nature of the equipment required and the bicycle, I wanted to be as foolproof as possible in my planning. I would have spent about, including the bicycle, about 7 lakhs even before I set foot on the Arctic. So the bicycle itself cost me about 3.5 lakhs, but you can make do with the bicycle at 1 or 2 lakhs also. But I wanted a roll-off hub, which is a very expensive piece of equipment from Germany. It's a gear system encased in a metal box, which is in the rear wheel. So it's basically fail-safe. A lot of a lot of gear systems tend to break down on such a long journey. So that was one. But rest of the equipment couldn't be helped. It had to be bought. So yes, in Indian rupee terms, it was about 7.5 lakhs. A lot of specialized food had to be bought, dried food, dehydrated food for the first 2 weeks in the Arctic. That also cost me some money. Uh, Tickets would have cost another 3.5 lakhs, both going and coming. So about 10 lakhs was the investment in the beginning itself. Thereafter, it wasn't that expensive. I mean, most cycling tourists around the world budget about $30 to $40 a day on an average. Some days you don't spend anything, and some days you end up spending $200, or maybe $150. You have a breakdown, or you have to spend a night in a motel which costs $50 because of a massive sandstorm or whatever. So yes, I budgeted about $40 a day, which worked out to about 80,000 rupees a month. So in all, I would say that over 1.5 years, if I had to just keep aside the bicycle money and the equipment money, okay, I spent about 10 lakhs, 10 to 12 lakhs on the journey, on myself, like living it out, transportation, ferry costs, museum costs, eating, sometimes eating out, or whatever. Medicine costs. I fell ill 3 times. I had typhoid. I had bronchitis. So that thankfully it was in Mexico, which is cheaper healthcare. But yes, that set me back. I had to stay in the city for 7 days because of that. So that kind of added up to my money, to money flowing out. In all, I would say about 20, 21 lakhs is what I spent, including 7, 8 lakhs on the equipment. But over 1.5 years, that was well worth the investment. And that investment came mainly from the money that I saved from the bonus I earned in my last job, and I had to withdraw some money from the PF as well to sustain myself in the last 2, 3 months. So yeah, it was that's how much money went on this whole piece.
During the trip, were you like writing any blogs or broadcasting the trip live? Something
Well,
like that.
I started off very ambitiously, frankly. I built a website. I had Facebook going on. I had Instagram going on. But suddenly 1 or 3 months later, I realized I was I would say, went through a different surreal experience of being detached from the world. And I think that happens to you once you're out in the wilderness. You no longer feel you're part of that world because you can't associate with it. So when you're with the earth, the wind, the animals for a very long time in complete silence every day, uh, there is there was a shift that happened, which took me away from being connected to the world in a digital sort of way. So while I did keep my family abreast to a lot of, like I had a small family group on Facebook, which only they got access, and for their satisfaction, for my parents' satisfaction, happiness, I kept it going. But to keep the world abreast, I stopped doing that after the first 2.5, 3 months. And because I realized this was my journey and I wanted to enjoy it, and I felt I was spending too much time uploading pictures, trying to find internet connections. You tend to get addicted to that kind of stuff, and that defeats the whole purpose of the journey itself. So I stopped doing it. But once I came back, I updated everything. Maybe on the way, I would go to an American library, a school library, or a college library where Wi-Fi was free, where you got subsidized rates for using a place where you could, put in your data in and transfer data from one place to the other and upload it. I used to do that once in a while, but I stopped maintaining it after some time. It was too much of an effort. Every day was more about survival, about food, water, and camping, and I found this was a bit of a distraction from being able to do that properly.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Nirjay is asking what inspired you to take on this trip. Like,
Well, many answers to that question. Uh, Purely speaking, it was a quest for the meaning and purpose to my life and to explore the world. And I felt that I needed to challenge myself and do something different and extraordinary with my life, uh, which was to really go back to my childhood dream and explore the world and look at different cultures. It was always a dream to go and mix with the indigenous cultures of the world, especially the ones that I've been reading about ever since I was a child. And at some point in life, you realize that what you're doing is really becoming meaningless. And what you really need to rediscover about yourself is what you love doing and what are your true passions. So I kind of didn't just think about it, I decided to take action on that and do something about it. And I did that. So it was like a quest, and that journey still exists. That journey is not yet over. I mean, internally inside me also, the journey still goes on. And a part of the journey I'm still expressing by writing. My second book is an expression of that journey and that desire to keep finding more and more about myself, the meaning and purpose of life, what we are meant to do. I think I've gone along a bit on the way. I have much more to go. I'll probably never find the answer, but it's the journey that makes it worthwhile.
Yeah. So Divya is asking you, were there times when you found yourself weak during your journey, and what kept you going during those days?
Well, weakness was not in spirit. Weakness was not psychologically at all. I was completely blindly in love with what I was doing. So the passion and the energy came from that. I think there were times when I was weak in body, sick especially. When I got typhoid in San Cristobal or I got bronchitis in the desert. I picked it up in Los Angeles. It was really bad. I couldn't breathe. Or when I had a very massive reaction to some dried grasshoppers that I ate. So all these little bit of sicknesses did make me weak in the body, and there was no alternative to it but to just rest for a few days, eat a lot of food, and get your energy back, and be patient. So I did that. So each illness set me back by about 7 8 days. So I lost a month of cycling almost because of that. Uh, over 1.5 years. But whenever I did feel weak in body and spirit, I would just pray, and I would steel myself to go and do it. I would think of all the people who've done great things in life in the outdoors, and they would inspire me in my mind. I read about them. I would read such stories. So yes, that would keep me going. It's all in the mind actually. It's a mental strength thing.
And what's your next adventure going to be?
Well, it's a good question. I always get asked that question, Vivek, and I know there are a lot of ventures yet to be completed. There is the Siberian route, there is the Silk route, there is a South American part which I couldn't complete. I couldn't reach Ushuaia, so I want to restart that as well. I'm 52 now, so but I still feel I can cycle easily for another 15 years, and I'll do it. At the moment, the pandemic, obviously, I haven't traveled for a year. Can you believe it? So no, it's very frustrating. But we will have a catch-up time for sure, and we will all get back to the road, and we will start seeing the world again in a year or two. But when that happens, I'll be out on the bicycle. Shorter adventures, Vivek. Shorter adventures, but more intense. Iceland, Scotland, maybe Siberia. Not 15,000 kilometers, or maybe 5,000 kilometers, 3,000 kilometers, stuff like that. But enough to write a book.
Has this journey changed your outlook towards life?
Completely. I mean, I was always a bit on the spiritual side. I always considered myself well read about some parts of the world, but from a from an outlook perspective, I I am currently quite a champion for the indigenous people, their rights. I do write a lot about that. Every forum I talk about it, and I hope I can do something practically for them someday. From a climate change perspective, I'm much more passionate, much more aware. I'm more aware of my impact on animals, for instance, eating meat, eating chicken. I turned vegan for almost 3 years after I came back, and only recently I've started eating a bit of egg again because my body I felt was lacking a natural protein diet. We don't get too much of vegan specialized food in India. While you can create a lot, but in a busy life, it's very difficult to assemble that food and make it for yourself. So, but yes, I turned vegan for 3 years. From 2017 to almost 6 months back, I was vegan, and I've just made myself mildly vegan, semi-vegan again. But yes, it changed my outlook towards animals, towards wildlife, towards nature in a more dramatic fashion. I was always sensitive towards it, but I wasn't strident in my views about it. Now I'm very strident, and I know what I stand for and what I don't stand
Okay, that's great. So, Dhruv, before we end this session, I would like to introduce the next speaker who is going to be on our show,
Okay.
Brigadier Hirak Kar, and I'm thankful to Nirja Sharma for introducing him to me. So, Brigadier Kar, if you can unmute yourself and just give us a brief about your session.
Uh, my passion is traveling. Before I say anything, I would actually like to ask Dhruva a few things. And what people asked him, what he was trying to answer as to why he did it, I think for him, the journey itself was his destination. The journey itself is his passion. Because more than anything else, he has covered a very long distance through very hard terrain. Having been in the army, I have also traveled through many terrains like this, but not on a cycle. But I'm aware, for example, at Peru, he was at 15,500 feet with no greenery around. I'm sure he had a lot of may have had a lot of shortage of oxygen problems. Anyway,
Yeah.
that was Dhruv. And Mr. Vivek is asking me to give a brief about my trip. My trip was very long ago. It was 1971. And we had really not planned the trip. So I can't give as much details as Dhruv gave because I have only one photograph out of that from that trip, and that too was on a Click 3 camera. No mobiles, nothing available those days. But I will take you through my motorcycle trip around India, which was not planned at all, but it had, what should I say? It was almost my start to travel, and I realized my passion for traveling, and which made me latest till date travel over 55 countries and all the 5 continents, including South America and Africa. So that is what I would like to speak about, sir.
So I have one question both for Dhruv and for you. Dhruv has also traveled solo, and your journeys have also been solo. So, is there a reason for going alone, or like, because if you have a partner, I think you have some kind of a backup or some person who can take care of the logistics, or maybe these days the photography and other things, so that you can like focus on your mission, on your journey.
You see, as far as I am concerned, I have traveled, I've done different types of traveling. Some, my wife went with me. Mostly I traveled alone. People say that you must be lonely when you're traveling alone. No, I don't feel lonely because en route you meet a lot of people, and I stay in these hostels and these Airbnb places, and there you meet a lot of people where you can form small groups, go around. You really don't feel lonely. And you see, over the years, it has always not been possible to get someone to travel with you because you have a leave, you have a children, and a thing like that. But see, this year in February, I traveled to South America. I got a friend who had retired on 31st December 2019. So I told him, what are you doing after retirement? Yeah, let's go to South America. He said, sure. And we pushed off in February, the first week of February. So it is not always that you get a company to go to do or travel like you would like to do. That's for me. I don't know about Dhruv.
Yeah.
I would completely agree. You don't get the company to travel, number one. And number two, travel is a very personal, especially this kind of travel is a very personal thing. Each one has a different objective in mind. I had a very different objective, which is to stop and explore and get deep into the culture of the place. Whereas, someone traveling with you may not share the same thoughts. Some people are in a hurry; they want to cover a lot of distance in a day. Some people don't like to keep stopping for pictures. Um, so you never really find the ideal travel companion for a journey like this. If you do, you're extremely lucky. So I found a lot of people who were cycling with their wives, spouses, and they were both adventure lovers. They both had the same interests, and they were in tandem with each other's thoughts. So that makes a big difference. The second part of it is being alone also gives you time to think, reflect, introspect, and go at your pace and do what you want to do. So it gives you a lot of freedom to be yourself. And so I prefer traveling solo.
Dhruv, like during your journey, were you ever scared? Because you were out in the wild.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
were
I
there?
was scared a few times, yes. Especially when I had to camp in the forest. The ancient forests of the Yukon, Canada have a mysterious energy of their own. And I'm telling you, I had the strangest dreams in my life, hallucination kind of dreams. I'm sleeping in those trees. That was one part of it. I've never dreamt of anything before that. So obviously there are spirits out there of some sort. Second part is camping in the wild was also very scary initially for me because I had to get over the fear of wild animals. So many times I would find bears circling my tent at night because I would inadvertently forget to remove a cream or some lotion or something from the tent because every night I had to I was carrying a Kevlar bag which I had to put my food into and tie it to a tree about 200, 300 meters away from my tent so that the bears are not attracted by the scent of the food. They can smell like candy a mile away. So yes, but even then they would smell me and be circling my tent at night. So to get over the fear of camping alone in the dark in the middle of nowhere with absolutely no way of defending yourself really, it took me a couple of weeks to get over that fear. But once I did get over it, I used to sleep like a baby. I had no problem at all. Uh, No animal really troubled me too much except for raccoons in the US who try to open the zip of my tent and get in and steal food. They are so slimy, They have they have human-like fingers. They can actually open a zip. And living over the years in the campground, they even learned how to open the zip of a tent from outside. So yeah, that was interesting bit of experience. I didn't feel scared in Mexico at all. A lot of people said, drug guys will come after you. I didn't feel scared. Never. I lost my fear after the first 2 weeks. The first 2 weeks was scary. Yeah.
And Brigadier Hirak is asking, did you have oxygen problem in Peru when you were at 15,500 feet?
Uh, Not really. Two things, sir. I mean, one was I had already cycled to Manali, from Manali to Khardungla about 6 years back. So I knew that I could survive at 18,000 feet also. That was one. Two, um, I knew how to take Dimox, so I took Dimox and I started my course well before I started climbing. And that helped me a lot. And I think the third is thankfully a genetic predisposition to being able to handle high altitude. I've never had a problem. I've been doing high altitude stuff for a long time in my life. And fortunately, though I never took it lightly, fortunately, I never had high altitude sickness, except a few times when I got a massive headache. But that was to be expected. But I never felt any nausea. Of course, I found it difficult to breathe. And to be carrying 40 kilos of gear on a bicycle and climbing a mountain in 15,000 feet was very tiring. I could barely cycle 25 kilometers a day. But yeah, I didn't fall sick.
So, you obviously chose the bicycle, and Brigadier Hirak, he chose a motorcycle.
Yes.
So that will be like next session. It's a kind of a logical jump. We are going from the manual mode to a auto mode. So I hope you will join us in that session. It will be on October 24th, and
Absolutely, yeah. I'll also love to join.
let's build it into a nice series. And like for Dhruv, I have a question. You must have had some footage that you would have shot. So any plans to come out with a series on YouTube or on some OTT platform, or maybe like Discovery Channel or Nat Geo, something like that?
Not really. Frankly, I have such a busy life now with work. Um, I head a company in India now, and it's becoming more and more difficult to be digitally in touch with things. I do a lot of it, and it's very tough to manage it. But at the moment, I don't have plans to start a YouTube channel. I have so much of content, I could make 10 films out of it. Unfortunately, I couldn't show the film that I've made. I'll try once more. Let me see if you can hear it. If you have 5 minutes, I could try to play it. Or maybe what I'll do is I'll WhatsApp the YouTube link to that film. You can send it to the group on your WhatsApp group. I could send it to you.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And
Yeah.
today's session was special in another way. Like we have the first speaker with whom we started this series, Saleja.
Yes.
Like she took us on a journey of all over India. You took us all over world.
Okay.
And again with Brigadier Hirak, we will be going over India and over the world. And
Yes.
the fourth speaker, I think she might also be here. I'm not sure. Dr. Neelima Desai, are you there in the room? I think she might have left, but she is into trekking, so high altitude
Wow.
trekking.
Okay. Oh wow. Okay.
And so she is from Pune. And
I see.
Kanaka, you are there. Is Dr. Neelima in the participants, among the participants?
She was here. I think she just left some time ago.
Okay, no problem. Her session
Yeah.
is next month. So when we have Brigadier Hirak's session, we can introduce her. But it was good to have the ex-speakers, the current speaker and the future speakers, everyone on the same day. So thanks a lot, Dhruv. It was a great
Thank
session.
you.
We will look forward to the video link, and some of our members have already ordered your book.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vivek, for having me here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was a pleasure talking to you and to have this exchange of thought.
Thank
Thanks
you. Thank you.
everyone, and see you next week,
Bye-bye.
same time.